January 29, 2020, Donington Hall, Leicestershire. A 230-year-old stately home that had survived 2 world wars, housed German prisoners of war, and served as the headquarters of a British airline, stood silent in the January frost. Inside, staff arrived for work as normal. By midday, accountants from BDO, one of the world's largest audit firms, had taken control of every asset on the premises. They checked the bank accounts. Norton Motorcycles, Britain's most decorated motorcycle brand, had £15,000 to its name. 122 years, 94 victories at the Isle of Man TT, 100,000 motorcycles built for Allied forces in 2 world wars. A brand that British Prime Ministers had personally endorsed on the world stage, gone into administration on a Wednesday morning before lunch. So who killed Norton? Not the market, not foreign competition, not changing tastes. One man with a collection of Aston Martins, a historic mansion, and a plan that the British government had funded with millions of pounds of taxpayers' money. This is what happened inside Donington Hall. In 1898, a man named James Lansdowne Norton opened a small workshop at 320 Bradford Street, Birmingham. He was not building motorcycles yet. He was making fittings and parts for bicycles, a modest trade in a city already crowded with engineers and manufacturers. But Norton, who his workers would come to call Pa, had ambitions that went beyond the workshop floor. By 1902, the first Norton motorcycle rolled out of Birmingham. By 1907, a Norton machine ridden by Rem Fowler won the twin-cylinder class at the very first Isle of Man TT race, a competition that would define British motorcycling for generations. That single victory was not a fluke. It was a declaration. Norton had arrived, and it intended to stay. What followed over the next 3 decades was not merely success. It was dominance of a kind that no British manufacturer has matched before or since. Between 1930 and 1937, Norton won 78 of 92 Grand Prix races entered. To the 9 Isle of Man Senior TTs, held between 1931 and 1939, Norton won 7. Riders like Jimmy Guthrie and Stanley Woods became household names on the back of machines built in Birmingham. The motorcycle press gave Norton a nickname that stuck for a century, the Unapproachable. When war came in 1939, Norton did not retreat. The factory shifted to military production and built nearly 100,000 motorcycles for Allied forces, the Model 16H and the Big 4, side-valve singles that carried dispatch riders across North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe. Soldiers who had never ridden a motorcycle before the war came home knowing the Norton name. In the post-war years, those same men walked into showrooms and asked for one. The late 1940s and 1950s brought a new generation of greatness. The 1946 Manx Taunton, a purpose-built racing machine sold to the public, became the most successful privateer racer in history. Then came the featherbed frame in 1950, designed by Rex McCandless, a chassis so revolutionary that riders said it felt like riding on a featherbed. It transformed not just Norton's racing program, but the entire industry's understanding of how a motorcycle should handle. Jeff Duke won the 500cc World Championship on a featherbed Norton in 1951. John Surtees, who would later win a Formula One world title, began his career on one. Norton won the Isle of Man Senior TT every year from 1947 to 1954. 8 consecutive victories. No manufacturer has come close to that record since. Then, slowly, the world changed. Italian factories, MV Agusta, Gilera, arrived at Grand Prix circuits with multi-cylinder machines that the aging Norton singles could not match on raw power. Japanese manufacturers began appearing in showrooms across Britain, offering reliability and affordability that the British industry struggled to answer. Norton, absorbed into the Associated Motorcycles Group in 1953 and then into Norton Villiers in 1966, kept fighting. In 1967 came the Commando, a 750cc parallel twin that won Motorcycle News Machine of the Year award for 5 consecutive years, a record that stands to this day. It was the last great act. By 1975, the factory doors in Birmingham closed for the last time. The brand passed into American hands, then into silence. For more than 3 decades, Norton existed as a name without a home, carried in the memories of riders who had grown up with it, displayed on garage walls in fading photographs, invoked in pub conversations as shorthand for everything British motorcycling had once been. What made Norton different from the dozens of other British motorcycle brands that vanished in the 1970s was precisely that memory. Velocette was gone. Vincent was gone. AJS, Ariel, BSA, all gone. But Norton carried something the others did not: 94 victories at the Isle of Man TT, a military record stretching back 2 world wars, and a nickname earned over half a century of racing that no marketing department could manufacture. The unapproachable. That name, that history, that weight of meaning, it was still worth something in 2008. Worth enough, in fact, for a businessman from Leicestershire to stake everything on bringing it back. The question was whether he was staking his own money or someone else's. Stuart Garner was 40 years old when he bought Norton Motorcycles in 2008. He was personable, well-dressed, and fluent in the language of British industrial revival. He spoke about heritage, craftsmanship, and the importance of keeping manufacturing in Britain. Journalists liked him, politicians liked him, and when he stood in front of a gleaming Norton Commando and talked about bringing a great British brand back from the dead, it was genuinely difficult not to believe him. The purchase price was £1.2 million. Garner acquired the rights to the Norton name from an American company based in Oregon, which had held the brand through years of fitful attempts at revival that had produced almost nothing. The British motorcycle press celebrated. A national treasure was coming home. What almost nobody knew at the time was where the money had come from. Garner had funded the purchase using a loan of almost £1 million from a company called Tudor Capital Management, run by 2 men named Andrew Meeson and Peter Bradley. The funds Meeson and Bradley provided to Garner were later shown in court to have been the proceeds of a tax fraud, a scheme in which the pair had claimed £5 million in fictitious income tax repayments from HMRC. In 2013, both men were convicted and sentenced to 8.5 years in prison. Court documents confirmed that £990,000 of the fraud proceeds had been loaned directly to Garner to finance the Norton acquisition. Garner maintained that he had no knowledge of any wrongdoing. He presented himself as a victim of the same fraudsters who had deceived others. But the purchase was made, the brand was his, and in 2008, none of that history had yet surfaced. The early years at Donington Park were, by any measure, compelling. Garner established a 15,000 square foot factory beside the famous racing circuit and set about re-engineering a 961cc parallel twin that an American designer had originally developed but never brought to production. His first appointment was Simon Skinner, poached from Triumph, who became head of design and remained with the company for more than a decade. Garner insisted on sourcing 80% of components from British suppliers. Deliveries of the new Commando 961 began in 2010, and the motorcycle press responded warmly. Here, against all expectation, was a hand-built British motorcycle that actually worked. In August 2011, Business Secretary Vince Cable travelled to Donington Park and stood beside Stuart Garner for the cameras. The government, Cable announced, was underwriting a £7.5 million bank loan to Norton under the Export Enterprise Finance Guarantee Scheme. The money would help Norton double annual production from 500 to 1,000 machines. Cable called Norton a prime example of British business innovation. The photographs appeared in newspapers across the country. Then, in March 2013, Garner made his most audacious move. Norton purchased Donington Hall, a Georgian stately home set in 80 acres of parkland adjacent to the Donington Park circuit from International Airlines Group for an undisclosed sum. The hall had previously served as the headquarters of British Midland International. It was 230 years old, with 42 hotel rooms, ancient deer park bordering the River Trent, and a history that included serving as a prisoner of war camp during the First World War. A German naval pilot named Gunther Ploshaw had escaped from it in 1915, the only successful escape from British captivity in either World War. Garner moved into the hall. Norton's corporate headquarters relocated to the adjacent Hastings House. The Priest House Hotel next door was acquired in 2016 to expand the hospitality operation. Stuart Garner, the man who had arrived with a borrowed £1 million, now lived in an 18th-century mansion on 80 acres of Leicestershire countryside. From the outside, this looked like the story of a visionary entrepreneur rebuilding a national institution brick by brick. The government believed it. The press believed it. And across Britain, hundreds of ordinary working people were about to be told that they too could be part of the Norton revival, if they were willing to invest their pension savings. They believed it as well. In 2012, savers across Britain began receiving a proposition. It came through financial advisors, through word of mouth, and through the quiet confidence that surrounds anything carrying government endorsement. The offer was straightforward. Transfer your existing pension into one of 3 new Norton schemes: the Dominator 2012, the Commando 2012, or the Donington MC scheme, and receive a tax-free lump sum in return, along with the satisfaction of investing in a genuine British success story. The schemes were registered with HMRC, they appeared legitimate, and backing them, visibly and publicly, was a brand that the business secretary had personally visited, that the Chancellor had praised, and that the Prime Minister would soon take to China as a symbol of British manufacturing excellence. Paul Finch was one of those who said yes. He was from Torquay, and he had spent 27 years working at Princess Yachts, building up a pension pot that represented, in his own words, his life. In 2012, he transferred it into the Norton pension scheme. He was not a sophisticated investor. He was a working man who had done what he thought was due diligence, checked the company's standing, noted the government support, and trusted that a scheme registered with HMRC and attached to a nationally celebrated brand could not be a vehicle for theft. He was wrong, and so were 227 others. Stuart Garner was the sole trustee of all 3 pension schemes. Under occupational pension law, a trustee is strictly prohibited from investing more than 5% of a scheme's assets in the employer's own company. Garner invested 100%. Every pound that savers transferred into the Dominator, Commando and Donington MC schemes was converted into preference shares in Norton Motorcycles. The money did not sit in a diversified fund. It did not grow in a managed portfolio. It went directly into Norton's operating account, where it was used to pay wages, fund development, and, by any reasonable assessment of the evidence, sustain a business that could not sustain itself. What made this more than straightforward mismanagement was the network of connections surrounding the schemes from the very beginning. The administrator of all 3 pension funds was a company called T12 Administration Ltd. Its directors were Andrew Meeson and Peter Bradley, the same 2 men who had provided Garner with the fraudulently sourced loan to buy Norton in 2008 and who were convicted of tax fraud in 2013. Meeson and Bradley had not merely been associates of Garner in one transaction. They were woven into the fabric of the Norton financial operation at every level, and Garner knew they were under investigation before the pension schemes were established. In May 2011, a full year before the first Norton pension scheme opened, Garner was interviewed by an officer of HMRC's Criminal Fraud Investigations Department as a witness in the case against Bradley and Meeson. He gave evidence for the prosecution at their trial at Birmingham Crown Court. He watched them be convicted and sentenced to 8.5 years in prison in March 2013. And then, with full knowledge of who had built the administrative framework of his pension schemes, he continued to allow working people to transfer their savings into them. The pensions regulator received its first reports of concern about the Norton schemes in 2012. The Financial Conduct Authority received similar signals in 2013. Neither body took effective action for years. The schemes continued to operate. The money continued to flow in. By the time the full picture emerged, the three schemes held approximately £14 million, almost all of it locked in preference shares in a company whose accounts, when eventually examined by administrators, would be described as a car crash. Norton had no separate account for pension assets. There was no ring fencing, no segregation, no protection of any kind. The savers' money was indistinguishable from the company's operating cash. Meanwhile, some of those same savers received letters from HMRC. The tax-free lump sums they had been promised as part of the pension transfer turned out to carry tax liability after all. People who had handed over their retirement savings received unexpected tax bills. They had not drawn their pensions, they had not chosen to access their funds. But in the eyes of HMRC, an unauthorized payment had been made, and they were liable for it. Paul Finch called his investment his life. Another saver described what he had lost as 30 years of work. A third had transferred a pension accumulated across a career in local government, reassured at every stage by the visible legitimacy that government endorsement had conferred on Norton and on Stuart Garner personally. In the years that followed, those people would write to their MPs, submit evidence to parliamentary committees, and wait for investigations, for hearings, for a reckoning that moved at the pace of institutional bureaucracy while their retirement funds remained locked in a failing company. They were still waiting when the next chapter of the Norton story unfolded, because even as the pension schemes were filling with money they would never return, the British government was preparing to give Stuart Garner something even more valuable than cash. It was about to give him credibility. In July 2015, George Osborne arrived at Norton's Donington Hall headquarters with cameras, press officers, and an announcement. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the second most powerful figure in the British government, stood beside Stuart Garner and declared a £4 million grant from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy to be shared between Norton and 11 of its supply chain partners. The photographs were perfect. The Chancellor in shirt sleeves, Garner in his element, the Norton logo visible in the background. A year later, Innovate UK, the government's innovation funding agency, operating under the same department, awarded Norton a further £2.1 million. These were not loans, they were grants. Taxpayers' money, given without the expectation of repayment, to a company whose pension schemes were already under quiet scrutiny from two separate regulators. The grants mattered for reasons that went beyond the money itself. Every time a government minister stood beside Stuart Garner for a photograph, every time a press release went out on official-headed paper, every time Norton was cited as an example of British manufacturing success, the implicit message to the outside world was identical. This company has been examined, assessed, and found worthy of public trust. For ordinary savers considering whether to transfer their pension into a Norton scheme, that message carried enormous weight. It was not merely reassurance. It was, in effect, a guarantee. Unofficial, unintended, but real in its consequences. The endorsements did not stop with grants and guarantees. The government made Garner an official export champion, a designation awarded to business leaders judged to exemplify British trading success, and used his image in a national advertising campaign. Ministers from across the political spectrum made the journey to Donington. Liam Fox visited. Stephen Barclay visited. The Norton story became a reliable set-piece in speeches about British industrial revival, deployed whenever a politician needed a tangible example of manufacturing ambition. Then, in February 2018, came the defining moment. Theresa May was Prime Minister. She was leading a trade mission to China, and she wanted to demonstrate that Britain, navigating the uncertainties of Brexit, remained open, ambitious, and commercially credible on the world stage. Stuart Garner travelled with her. He stood alongside the Prime Minister in Beijing. The photographs circulated globally. A British motorcycle manufacturer, at the side of a British Prime Minister in the world's largest market. At the precise moment those photographs were being taken, the pensions regulator was conducting a formal investigation into the Norton pension schemes. The regulator had opened its inquiry in 2017. It was looking at the same schemes that had been flagged for concern in 2012, that had continued operating through the convictions of Meeson and Bradley in 2013, and that had, by 2018, accumulated the savings of 228 people who had been encouraged to trust their retirement funds to a sole trustee with no professional qualifications for the role. The investigation was not public. The trade mission photographs were, and for anyone watching from the outside, the image of Garner beside May in Beijing made the Norton schemes look safer than they had ever been. It is worth pausing on the arithmetic of what the British government put into Norton between 2011 and 2018. More than £5 million in direct grants and funding, a government-backed bank guarantee of £7.5 million, official designation as an export champion, the personal endorsement of 4 separate government ministers, including 2 chancellors and a prime minister. In return, the government received photographs, press releases, and a cautionary tale that parliamentarians are still trying to learn from. Meg Hillier, chair of the Public Accounts Committee, would later accuse officials of blindly pouring millions into Norton before it collapsed. She was right about the blindness, but the blindness was not accidental. It was the natural consequence of a system in which political optics and economic storytelling had become more important than financial due diligence. The pension savers who had been drawn in by that same narrative had no way of knowing that the credibility being sold to them had been assembled from press releases and photo opportunities rather than from any rigorous assessment of the company's financial health. They had done what any reasonable person would do. They had looked at the evidence available to them, the ministerial visits, the government grants, the export champion designation, the Prime Minister's trade mission, and concluded that Norton Motorcycles was a safe and serious enterprise. By 2019, the reality inside Donington Hall was pulling further from that image with every passing month. The pension money had been spent, the government grants had been spent, the bank facilities were stretched, and the products that were supposed to justify all of it, the motorcycles that were going to carry the Norton name back into the world, were running badly behind schedule, mired in the consequences of a decade of promises that had consistently outrun the company's ability to deliver. The gap between what Norton claimed to be and what it actually was had become a chasm, and it was about to open completely. The Norton Commando 961 was, by most accounts, a genuinely beautiful motorcycle. Hand-built, air-cooled, styled after the classic commandos of the late 1960s, it attracted the kind of attention that no amount of marketing could manufacture. Journalists who rode it praised its character, its sound, its connection to a tradition of British engineering that had seemed permanently lost. At shows and rallies, people stopped and stared. The waiting lists were long. That was part of the problem. Delivering motorcycles to customers who had paid deposits required capital, components, skilled labor, and a production process disciplined enough to meet deadlines. Norton under Stuart Garner had the first and second intermittently, the third in modest quantities, and the fourth almost never. Customers who had placed orders waited months, then years. Some received their motorcycles, many did not. Some who asked for refunds found that their requests went unanswered, emails unreturned, telephone calls deflected, promises made and quietly forgotten. This was not a new problem. Industry observers had been raising concerns about Norton's delivery record almost since production began in 2010. But the concerns were repeatedly drowned out by the noise of new announcements, new models, and new deals that kept the Norton story moving forward in the press even as the reality inside the factory fell further behind. In 2017, Norton unveiled the V4 1200cc superb bike at the NEC Motorcycle Live Show in Birmingham. It was spectacular. A 200 horsepower, hand-built British superbike priced at over £40,000, competing directly with the finest machines from Italy and Austria. The motorcycle press responded with something close to euphoria. Here was Norton not merely surviving, but attacking the very top of the market. Orders were taken. Deposits were collected. Not a single V4 was ever delivered to a retail customer. The following year, 2018, Norton unveiled the Atlas 650, a more affordable parallel twin aimed at broadening the customer base and finally achieving the volume production that had been promised since the early days at Donington Park. The launch at Motorcycle Live drew crowds. The design was warmly received. Deposits poured in from riders who saw the Atlas as Norton's gateway to relevance in a competitive mid-range market. The Atlas never entered production under Garner's ownership. By the time administrators arrived in January 2020, Norton was holding more than £3 million in customer deposits from approximately 466 potential buyers. Because of what BDO described as a lackadaisical approach to accounting, these funds had never been held in a separate client account. They had been absorbed into Norton's general operating cash, spent, in effect, before the motorcycles they were meant to secure had been built. When administration began, there was no mechanism to identify and return those deposits. The 466 customers joined the queue of creditors behind Metrobank, behind HMRC, behind suppliers who had delivered components and never been paid. The deals that Garner had announced with such fanfare told a similar story. In August 2017, Norton signed an agreement with Chinese manufacturer Zhongshan, reported to be worth millions of pounds, licensing the new 650cc engine platform and opening the Chinese market. The financial details of what Norton received were never publicly confirmed. In the days immediately before administration, Garner was reported to have sold the rights to the 961 engine to another Chinese company, Jinlang. Where the proceeds of that transaction went was never established. When BDO opened the accounts, Norton had $211,000 in one bank account and £15,000 in another. The BDO administrator's report, made public through Companies House in early 2020, was a document of sustained institutional failure. It revealed that during the financial year ending March 2018, Stuart Garner had borrowed £160,000 from his own company, a loan that remained outstanding at the point of administration. A separate loan of £324,002 made by Norton to another Garner-owned company had been deemed irrecoverable and written off in the same year. The accounts had not been filed on time. The bookkeeping was inconsistent. The financial controls that any creditor, regulator, or investor would expect to find in a manufacturing business of Norton's stated ambitions simply did not exist. And yet, through all of it, Donington Hall stood. The Georgian mansion in its 80 acres of Leicestershire parkland, the hotel next door, the ancient deer park, the garages. Whatever was happening inside Norton's accounts, the physical grandeur of Garner's world remained intact, a stage set maintained in perfect condition, while the production it was supposed to support quietly disintegrated behind the scenes. By the autumn of 2019, HMRC had lost patience. The tax authority took Norton to court over £300,000 in unpaid taxes, a sum so small relative to the grants and guarantees the government had provided that it reads almost as a footnote. But small debts, when a company has £15,000 in the bank, are fatal. The hearing was set for early 2020. Norton could not pay, and this time nobody was coming to save it. The morning of Wednesday, January 29, 2020, began like any other at Donington Hall. The Georgian facade caught the pale winter light. Rooks moved in the bare oaks along the driveway. Inside the Hastings House offices, staff arrived at their desks, switched on computers, and settled into the routines of a working day. On the production floor nearby, part-finished motorcycles sat in various stages of assembly. Among them, machines that customers had been waiting for since 2018. On the walls, plans for the Atlas 650 still hung alongside renders of a global Norton operation that had never existed outside the imagination of its creator. What the staff did not know, what most of them could not have known, was that the HMRC tax hearing scheduled for February had become irrelevant. The decision had already been made, not by a government department or a regulator, but by Metro Bank, Norton's largest secured creditor, owed £2 million by the motorcycle company and a further £3 million by Donington Hall estates, had concluded that further forbearance served no purpose. That morning, Metro Bank appointed BDO as administrator of Norton Motorcycles, UK Ltd. The call came through to Donington before noon. Lee Causer, a business restructuring partner at BDO, assumed control of the company. His team moved through the buildings methodically: the offices, the workshop, the showroom, the storage areas. What they found was a company that had, in the most literal sense, run out of road. In the workshop, 69 motorcycles were identified either at Donington or at locations elsewhere in the world, machines in varying states of completion, representing months or years of customer waiting. In the bank accounts, $211,000 in one account, £15,000 in another. Against this, Metro Bank alone was owed more than £7 million across the two Garner-owned entities. Staff at the adjacent Priest House Hotel were called into a meeting that afternoon and told that the hotel had also entered administration. Legacy Hotel and Resorts was contacted and agreed to manage the property temporarily while a buyer was sought. Donington Hall Estates, the company that owned the mansion itself, entered administration simultaneously. 3 Garner businesses collapsed in a single afternoon. Stuart Garner released a brief statement. He was, he said, devastated for everyone associated with the company. He did not appear in public. He did not address the pension savers, the deposit holders, or the suppliers who were owed money. He did not walk through the factory one last time or speak to the workers who had built motorcycles in his name for more than a decade. The statement was issued, and then there was silence. BDO's Lee Causer told the press that the administrators were taking all necessary steps to support customers, staff, and suppliers through the process. It was the language of professional composure in the face of institutional ruin, carefully chosen, scrupulously neutral, and entirely inadequate to describe what had actually happened to the people on the other side of it. Comes Britain, on the afternoon of January 29, 2020. Telephones rang and notifications arrived on screens. The news spread through the motorcycling community with the speed of something that had been half expected and was still, when it came, a shock. Forums filled, social media filled, riders who had owned Nortons, who had admired Nortons, who had placed deposits for Nortons they had never received, began the process of understanding what administration actually meant for them. For the 466 customers holding deposit receipts, the answer was brutal. Their money, more than £3 million in total, had not been held separately. It had been spent. BDO confirmed that because Norton's accounting had failed to segregate customer deposits from operating funds, the money could not be identified or returned. The deposit holders became unsecured creditors. They would join the queue, behind Metro Bank, behind HMRC, behind trade creditors, and receive whatever fraction of their money, if any, survived the administration process. For the 228 pension savers, January 29th was not an ending. It was merely the moment when the scale of what had already happened became impossible to ignore. Their money had been gone for years, converted into preference shares in a company that was now worth less than the debt it owed to a single bank. The pensions ombudsman had already begun proceedings. The pensions regulator was already investigating. But investigations moved slowly, and the people waiting for their outcomes were in their 50s and 60s, looking at retirements that had been quietly hollowed out, while government ministers posed for photographs in the same building where the fraud had been conducted. Paul Finch, from Torquay, had transferred 27 years of pension savings into the Norton schemes in 2012. He had done his research. He checked the company's standing at Companies House. He had noted the government endorsements, the ministerial visits, the export champion designation. He had concluded, as any reasonable person would, that a company so publicly supported by the British state could not be a vehicle for the theft of working people's retirement funds. He was wrong, and he was not alone. Billy Wallace was 59 years old when Norton went into administration. He had invested his pension savings into the Norton schemes and lost them. He would eventually receive £33,000 in compensation, the fraud compensation fund's best effort at partial restitution. Without the fraud, he estimated his pension would have been worth £60,000. He would have to wait years for the money to arrive, held in a newly created account while trustees calculated how to distribute funds across 228 claimants. He could not access it immediately. There was no apology attached to the transfer, no acknowledgement of what had been taken. Inside Donington Hall, as the administration teams worked through the buildings on January 29th, they passed through rooms that told the story of what Norton had been, and what it had actually been. The showroom with its gleaming commandos, the walls with their racing photographs, their Isle of Man trophy replicas, their framed press cuttings stretching back to Rem Fowler and 1907. The boardroom where Garner had sat opposite ministers, opposite journalists, opposite bankers, opposite anyone who might provide the next injection of money that would keep the performance running for another season. In the garage, the Aston Martins were gone. Garner had already removed them. The plans for global expansion still hung on the office walls, arrows pointing outward to markets in China, India, North America, Southeast Asia. The arrows pointed at a world that Norton had never reached and now never would. On the production floor, the 69 unfinished motorcycles sat in the January cold, waiting for an owner who no longer existed to complete them. Outside, the deer moved in the parkland as they always had. The River Trent ran along the boundary of the estate as it always had. Donington Hall stood as it had stood for 230 years, through wars, through occupations, through the rise and fall of everyone who had ever tried to make something of it. It would outlast Stuart Garner, as it had outlasted everyone else. The administration of Norton Motorcycles did not produce a swift reckoning. What followed January 29, 2020, was something considerably slower and considerably less satisfying. A sequence of investigations, hearings, determinations, and prosecutions that stretched across 4 years and delivered, in the end, a series of outcomes that left almost everyone involved feeling that justice had been approximated rather than achieved. The first significant ruling came in June 2020, 5 months after administration began. The Pensions Ombudsman issued a 96-page determination on the Norton pension schemes, a document that, in the careful language of regulatory adjudication, amounted to a devastating indictment. The Ombudsman found that Stuart Garner had acted dishonestly. He had profited from the schemes. He had feigned his duties as trustee in ways that were not accidental or negligent, but deliberate. Garner was ordered to repay approximately £14 million to the 3 schemes, plus a further £180,000 in distress payments to 30 members whose repeated requests for the return of their funds had been ignored over many years. Garner appealed the distress payment element. He was refused permission to appeal on the principal finding. Shortly afterwards, he filed for personal bankruptcy. The bankruptcy was not incidental. It was, in practical terms, the mechanism by which Garner ensured that the £14 million order would never be fulfilled. A bankrupt individual cannot be compelled to repay debts from assets he no longer holds. The Fraud Compensation Fund, a statutory body funded by levies on the financial services industry and ultimately by the British taxpayer, became the only viable means of restitution for the 228 pension savers. In 2024, the fund paid out £9.4 million to the collapsed schemes. Trustees spent months calculating each individual's entitlement before the money could be distributed. From Garner himself, as a direct consequence of his bankruptcy, the fund received £36,400. £36,000 against a debt of £9.8 million, a recovery rate of less than half of 1%. The criminal prosecution came in February 2022, when Garner appeared at Derby Magistrates Court and pleaded guilty to 3 charges of breaching employer-related investment rules, 1 charge for each pension scheme into which he had illegally directed savers' money. The charges were brought under Section 40 of the Pensions Act 1995, which prohibits trustees from investing more than 5% of scheme assets in the employer's own company. Garner had invested 100%. On March 31, 2022, at Derby Crown Court, Sue Donado was sentenced to 8 months in prison, suspended for 2 years. He did not go to prison. The reaction from the pension savers who had followed the case through hearings, determinations, and delays spanning a decade was not difficult to predict. People who had lost their entire retirement savings, who had received unexpected tax bills for money they had never chosen to access, who had waited years for investigations to conclude and compensation funds to be calculated. Those people watched a man who had taken £11 million of their money walk out of Derby Crown Court with a suspended sentence and a bankruptcy that had effectively immunized him against the financial consequences of his actions. Nicola Parrish, Executive Director of Frontline Regulation at the Pensions Regulator, described Garner's conduct as a failure to comply with restrictions designed to protect pension scheme members. The language was precise, measured, and wholly inadequate to the experience of the people it was describing. In July 2023, MPs launched a formal inquiry into the prosecution of the pension fraud case. The inquiry summoned representatives from the pensions regulator and other financial regulators to give evidence on why the case had taken so long, why the charges brought were limited to the 5% investment rule rather than fraud, and why 2 separate regulatory bodies had received warnings about the Norton schemes in 2012 and 2013 and allowed them to continue operating for years afterwards. The answers that emerged from those sessions confirmed what the pension savers had suspected throughout, that the regulatory system had not failed through a single dramatic error, but through the accumulated weight of slow processes, divided responsibilities, and an institutional reluctance to act decisively against a company that carried the personal endorsement of ministers at the very highest level of the British government. Norton Motorcycles had been too good a story to stop, even when the story was demonstrably false. I can actually perceive the point. I spring. I went out. I'm getting up. I can timberly find them. I should happen list on the clom. I am looking out if I may do it. I walk to that. I wouldn't all and work their way. I keep me from something that shouldn't. I am really closer, and my thoughts. On April 17, 2020, less than 3 months after administration began, BDO announced that a buyer had been found. TVS Motor Company, India's 3rd largest motorcycle manufacturer, headquartered in Chennai, with annual production measured in millions of units rather than hundreds, acquired the Norton brand, its intellectual property, and selected assets for £16 million in cash. Stuart Garner would have no role in the new company. The announcement was made on a Friday. By Monday, the Norton name belonged to India. The irony was not lost on the motorcycling press. A brand that had spent 12 years being marketed as the definitive expression of British manufacturing identity, hand-built, British-sourced, rooted in Leicestershire soil, had been rescued from the consequences of that marketing by a conglomerate based in Chennai, whose closest association with Britain was a passing admiration for the Norton logo. TVS moved quickly and methodically, in ways that contrasted sharply with everything that had preceded them. In late 2021, the company opened a new manufacturing facility at Monkspath in Solihull, 30 miles from Donington Hall, in a city with deep roots in British automotive history. More than 100 workers were hired in the initial phase. The production line was properly equipped, properly staffed, and properly managed. Motorcycles were built to schedule. Orders were fulfilled. Customers who placed deposits received their machines. The Atlas 650, the model that Garner had launched at Motorcycle Live in 2018 to considerable excitement, collected deposits for, and never delivered, was formally cancelled by TVS in 2022. The new ownership was direct about the reason. The Atlas belonged to a previous era and did not meet the standards the company intended to set. Deposit holders were advised to submit claims to BDO's liquidation process. Most received little or nothing. In its place, TVS developed a new generation of Norton motorcycles, among them the V4CR, a cafe racer built around the 1200cc V4 engine that Garner had unveiled with such fanfare in 2017 and never put into production. Under TVS, the V4CR reached showrooms. Riders bought it, rode it, and reviewed it. The process by which a motorcycle goes from announcement to delivery, a process that had defeated Garner across 12 years and multiple models, was completed by his successors within 2 years of acquisition. The Commando 9161, refined and rebuilt to address the quality issues that had accumulated under the previous ownership, returned to production and was received warmly when it re-emerged in 2023. The racing program was revived. The brand began, cautiously and without extravagant promises, to rebuild the credibility that Garner's tenure had so comprehensively destroyed. Donington Hall itself was purchased in April 2021 by Motorsport Vision, the organization that operates the neighboring Donington Park racing circuit. The stately home that Garner had used as his personal residence, bought with Norton's money and administered into insolvency alongside the motorcycle company, was converted into a facility for supercar storage and high-end motor engineering. The deer still move in the parkland. The River Trent still runs along the boundary. The building endures as it always has, indifferent to the ambitions of everyone who has ever claimed to own it. Norton, rebuilt and relocated, was making motorcycles again. The name had survived. The legend, though diminished, had not been extinguished. What had been extinguished was harder to replace. James Lansdowne Norton died in 1925 at the age of 56. He had spent his adult life building motorcycles in Birmingham, watching them win races, and running a company that was perpetually short of money and perpetually ahead of its competitors on the track. He died from the effects of overwork, a man consumed by the thing he had made, who never accumulated significant personal wealth, and who left behind a name that outlasted him by a century. In the year of his death, his motorcycles won the senior and sidecar TTs at the Isle of Man. He was too ill to travel. He watched the results arrive by telegram. 95 years later, a man who had used that name to raise funds from 2 convicted fraudsters, drain the pension savings of 228 working people, collect millions in government grants, and live in an 18th-century mansion at the company's expense, walked out of Derby Crown Court with a suspended sentence. He contributed £36,000 toward a debt of nearly £10 million. He filed for bankruptcy. He kept the Aston Martins until the administrators came for them. The distance between those two men, between Pa Norton in his Birmingham workshop and Stuart Garner in Donington Hall, is the distance between a legend and its exploitation. 3 questions remain, and none of them have been answered satisfactorily. The first is about the regulatory system. The pensions regulator received warnings about the Norton schemes in 2012. The Financial Conduct Authority received similar signals in 2013. The Pensions Ombudsman, when it finally ruled in June 2020, described Garner's conduct as dishonest and deliberate, language that implies the wrongdoing was identifiable, not hidden. Why did it take 8 years from the first warning to a criminal prosecution? Why were the charges limited to a technical breach of the 5% investment rule rather than fraud? The parliamentary inquiry launched in 2023 asked those questions. The answers confirmed that the regulatory architecture had functioned exactly as designed, slowly, cautiously, and with a consistent preference for the least confrontational available option. The second question is about government endorsement. When a Chancellor of the Exchequer stands beside a company director for a photograph, when a Prime Minister takes that same director on a trade mission to China, when an official designation of export champion is awarded and publicized at public expense, what obligation does the government assume toward the people who rely on that endorsement as a signal of trustworthiness? The pension savers who transferred their retirement funds into the Norton schemes were not naive. They were doing what the available evidence suggested was reasonable. The available evidence had been curated, amplified, and distributed by the British government. That government has never formally acknowledged its role in creating the conditions under which the fraud flourished. The third question is the oldest and the hardest. It is about what a legend is worth, and to whom. The Norton name carried genuine meaning. 94 TT victories, 100,000 military motorcycles, the featherbed frame, the commando, 5 consecutive Machine of the Year awards. That meaning was real, accumulated over decades by engineers, riders, and workers who had no financial interest in its exploitation. Stuart Garner did not create the Norton legend. He purchased it for £1.2 million of someone else's money and used it as collateral for everything that followed. The legend survived him, is being vivisected again in Solihull by a company that has demonstrated in the 4 years since acquisition that it is possible to build Norton motorcycles properly, deliver them on time, and honour the name without stealing from the people who believed in it. But Billy Wallace is retired now, on a pension that is worth £27,000 less than it should be. Paul Finch's life savings were spent before he knew they were gone, and Stuart Garner is free. The Norton name endures. The cost of preserving it was paid by people who could least afford it.